And I think that in itself is a pretty simplistic way of looking at it, but I think it really does have a lot of impact for us. If you just think about an opportunity, and it's not necessarily that you go out thinking I'm going to share today, but the question is, are you praying that way? Are you praying that if God had that door open or that window open, that you would, look through it or walk through it, or however that analogy is supposed to go? It's interesting that we, as a church culture, and remember we've talked about kind of developing this culture of evangelism at Grace, we continually see people involved in it, and I think that's a pretty cool thing. Did any of you go down to Covina to help out that lady's house? I'm just kind of curious. We had a little team of people that went down. There was an elderly woman who couldn't afford to clear the brush out of her yard, and the fire department was telling her she needed to do it. And so Steve Kilker, who kind of runs a lot of our local outreach stuff here at Grace, put a group of people together that went down, and that's a pretty good trek all the way down to Covina. Worked on a hillside most of all the day just to clear it so that she could meet the codes that she needed to do. And what they had kind of known was that this old elderly lady has a caregiver that has been witnessing to her whenever the opportunity came along, but nothing had really come to that point where she seemed to be all of that responsive. But whatever reason, God's appointment was for these people to go down and just be a servant to her who didn't know her, who came from a long distance away. And at the end of the day, she gave her life to Christ. So that is just taking an opportunity. It's just saying, we don't know what God's going to do. And it's not necessarily that every time somebody's going to respond. I was reading an interesting update from Landon and Jenny Lamas. You remember Jenny was in here. And they just walk into the public schools there, because this youth group that they have, they're high school students in their youth group at their church, and the high school students will just say to their English teacher, hey, could we invite our American friends to come to school with us? And unlike America, these folks, Landon and Jenny, can just walk onto a school campus without any ID, without any resume, with any background check, without any principal giving them okay, and the teacher will reorganize the entire time for the class just so that they can talk to their students and invite them to come to a learning English camp, which is what they run during the summer that a lot of our youth have gone over to Czech Republic to do. I mean, it's an amazing opportunity, but somebody's just got to walk through the door and do that, and that's what they're doing. Jenny met 4 boys at one of these English camps a number of years ago, before she actually came to California to get married. And she had met with these guys, I don't know, a couple of times, maybe 3 or 4 times, and they were really just trying to catch her. They were trying to kind of use and abuse. Of course, she's cute, so they're probably trying to do that too. But the whole idea of trying to discredit her faith was really where they were all about, because they were all atheists. Most of the country is that way. She came back here. She went back with Landon to find that 2 of those people were now Christ followers. One is a pastor of a church plant, and the first person he baptized in his church was the other guy. Now, again, this is just seed planting. I'm sure Jenny would have liked to have gone back and led them all to Christ, but by the time she got back, Christ had already done that work for her through somebody else. So how do you do that? Well, you just kind of have to make yourself available, be willing to share, be willing to pray, and God does the rest of the work. That's really what I believe Stiles' book is trying to help us understand. We just need to feel like we take all of the conversion thing off of our head and put it onto God's where it needs to be, and we just share. We just kind of, whenever the opportunity arrives, we do that. But we also pray. We also try to open that door that way. And so I think the three questions that Stiles talks to that I would encourage you to consider. One is this: are you motivated? Are you motivated to do it? If you're like me, I'm probably a little bit reluctant at times, simply because one, I don't want to be rejected. Two, I don't want to be made to look stupid. And or three, I don't necessarily want somebody that I'm in relationship with to feel awkward in the midst of that. And probably all those are excuses, but they're the best ones I could come up with. So the question is, do we really have compassion for them? When we look at people, do we see them as people who are either going to heaven or going to eternal judgment? I have to remind myself of that, because there are too many times where I look at people and I just say, well, they're going to get what they deserve. And then I forget that I'm one of those people that should have gotten what I deserve, but God in His grace has given me something different. That's a whole different ballgame. That's a mindset. That's a motivation we need to have. And we don't want to motivate people with guilt. We simply want to motivate them through the Scriptures, because the Scriptures call us to that hope and to that sense of just proclaiming. We are ambassadors for Christ, that 2 Corinthians passage tells us. And an ambassador is just basically trying to go between two warring factions, God and the non-believer, and trying to bring them together. That's all we're trying to do. Secondly, are we equipped? Because a lot of people just never feel that they know the gospel well enough, or they never feel that they can defend it well enough. And my guess is, and I hope maybe it's your experience too, that most of the time it's just a matter of me being authentic about what God did in my life. And then if they're interested in that, or they seem to respond to that, then I can take them through that creation and destruction and rescue and response kind of idea that we know to be the gospel as it's presented here. But the question is too, being able to look at people the same way that God does, and at the same time not always believe, because I think a lot of Christians believe that everybody that comes to church is a believer. And when I stand up there every Sunday morning and I look out on that congregation, I have to remind myself there are people out here that don't believe. They think they do, but they don't. And so we need to be a people who speak the gospel to one another, who constantly are reminding each other we're undeserving sinners that God has chosen to set His grace upon if we, by faith, choose to follow, to believe and follow. And in the midst of that, continually tell it over and over and over. Now, we do that in our preaching. My hope is we do that in our singing, whether we're singing, as we just did, How Great Thou Art, or whether we're singing In Christ Alone. We're singing the gospel, and I believe our worship should always tell the gospel. In fact, I'm even pulling out this week Rock of Ages. When was the last time you sang that in church? That's a hymn that was actually written not out of some kind of deep personal experience, as some hymns are, but as a way of kind of fending off an argument that was going back and forth between those who were Arminian, those who were Calvinists. And the guy who wrote this hymn, Toplady, was somebody who initially was kind of very influenced by the Wesleys and their kind of Arminian theology, and then started to hear Calvin during the Reformation and talking about some of the whole idea that we don't bring anything to this at all. It's all God. It's all that God does. It's not something that we prove to God that we deserve, or that somehow we can be this perfect person. And so he writes Rock of Ages. He actually wrote it in an article that he had written, just to refute that idea that I don't bring anything to you, God. You've done it all. And so hide me in the cleft of the rock. That's really what that whole thing is saying. So that's my hope too, that we not only hear the gospel and teach the gospel, but we sing the gospel to one another. That will equip us. And then the third thing, in addition to are we motivated and are we equipped, is are we available? And that's always a question, depending upon your lifestyle, because so many would just very easily pass the whole thing off by just saying, I just don't have time. I don't have time. And I understand that. There are people in this room that have no non-Christian friends. I know that to be true. Because I'm almost one of them. I work in a church, for goodness sake. You know, I just don't, I don't spend much time around non-Christian people. And I'm not home enough to be around my neighbors that much. Although the people across the street are believers, and the people on one side of me are believers, and the people on this side think they're believers, and there's one that lives up the street that is a believer. And so it's that kind of environment. So I have to be careful that I have to place myself in opportunities that would say I need to get out there and meet somebody who's not a Christian, so that hopefully something in me would shine. And I understand we don't all have the same calling and all have the same opportunities, but those are the three things that I would encourage you to just ask of yourself. Am I motivated to do this? Am I available to do it? Am I equipped to do it? And I think if you do that, you'll find that those opportunities of just being willing to share, just being willing to pray, and just being willing to take whatever opportunity comes will finally kind of start moving you in the direction we want people to go. Make sense? Okay, so we'll